Our next speaker is Jiayi, who is a postdoc at the McMaster University. Can you start sharing your screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So he will talk about the PHANGS survey, which is one of the large programs with ALMA.
Thank you for the introduction. So my research mainly uses ALMA to study the cold ISM and star formation in nearby galaxies. And so it's my great pleasure to share my research in this wonderful ALMA Focus conference. So in this talk, I'll be talking about the vertical scale height of the molecular gas in these galaxies. And specifically, I want to address the question of how we can infer the unobservable third dimension in this kind of typical moderately inclined galaxy, so that we can get a complete picture of the gas distribution both across the galaxy plane and perpendicular to it. So let me start my talk by just saying that this vertical scale height of the ISM is a very fundamental quantity. First of all, it directly links our observable surface densities to the arguably more physical volume densities. And so this is vital for the study of volumetric star formation laws, as nicely illustrated by the Bashini et al. Paper series. Second, this quantity encodes information about turbulence driving in the ISM. More specifically, it is often argued to be either the outer turbulence driving scale or the transition point in the turbulence power spectrum from a three-dimensional to two-dimensional mode. And finally, this quantity underpins models of the ISM that evolve assumptions about dynamical equilibrium, especially along the vertical direction. And therefore, it is important for like feedback regulated star formation models, such as the model put together by Stryker et al. Although it's very important, unfortunately, this quantity cannot be directly observed in most galaxies because, again, most galaxies are not edge-on. And it's really hard, usually in astronomy, to infer what was the line of sight depth of the object we were observing. But hopefully, it can be measured, or it can be inferred rather, by assuming hydrostatic equilibrium of the gas. So the basic idea is like this. The classic assumption you adopt is plane parallel smooth isothermal gas disk. And here is a quick illustration of that in the edge-on orientation. The basic physics to involve here is just the gravity exerted on the gas is balanced by the pressure in the gas. And if you work through the math and adopt some reasonable assumptions, you will see that actually the scale height of the gas is directly related to both the velocity dispersion of the gas and the density distribution in the galaxy. And usually this density distribution is mostly dominated by stellar components. This is usually the case in massive star-forming disk galaxies. So this idea seems very clean and simple, but the reality is much messier than that, because we know that the cold ISM, especially the molecular phase, is neither smooth nor isothermal. In reality, the molecular ISM are mostly concentrated into dense, massive molecular clouds. And therefore, our simple model needs some tweaking. So the good thing is that if you consider these molecular clouds, there's one simplifying assumption you can add, which is to treat these individual molecular clouds as bullets bouncing up and down in the galaxy disk. And this essentially views individual molecular clouds as self-regulating entities, which is usually okay, especially for the more massive molecular clouds that we can see in the observation. So then we can follow a similar line of logic, and we can, again, use this simplifying equation to infer now the scale height of the entire molecular cloud distribution in the disk. But there's a catch. For this velocity dispersion term, if we adopt this cloud bouncing up and down pictures, we need to be more careful about what velocity dispersion we use. More specifically, we need to differentiate between the velocity dispersion inside individual molecular clouds, which I term intra-cloud dispersion, with the dispersion of the cloud-to-cloud motion. And to provide more specific details, this intra-cloud term is actually more like responding to the local enhanced gravitational field inside individual clouds. And therefore, it is more directly related to the size of the cloud rather than like necessarily the total scale height of the molecular disk. The second term here is actually what is responding to the large-scale gravitational potential in the galaxy. And therefore, it is more directly related to the overall thickness molecular ISM. So the idea here is to switch in this cloud-to-cloud velocity dispersion in this formula, and then we can use the same idea to get out the scale height of the galaxy disk. So this seems like a reasonable idea, but does it really work? We figured it would be a good idea to first test this in numerical simulation. And it is actually a relatively good experiment to do with numerical simulation because there's no stringent requirement on the simulation. You don't need to get perfect chemistry. You don't need like the fancy radiative transfer on the fly. What you need is just reasonable dense gas with clumpy structure. And then you can just let gravity and kinematics play out and see how it is working. So we use this high resolution galaxy scale array simulation run by my collaborator, Sarah Jefferson. And we try to calculate an estimated scale height based on the cloud-to-cloud or intra-cloud velocity dispersion, as I just mentioned. And then we compare that estimate to the true scale height, which we can directly get from simulation because we know all the ground truths. And the comparison is summarized in this slide. So on the left-hand side, we are seeing two velocity dispersion as a function of galactocentric radius. The bottom here, this is the cloud-to-cloud velocity dispersion I just mentioned. But the top curve here is the total velocity dispersion of the gas as you will measure from a low resolution, say KBC scale CO observation. So if you compare the two, you see that, of course, this total is much higher than the cloud-to-cloud term, just because that also includes the contribution from the velocity dispersion within each molecular cloud. And if you now see how it is reflected inside the scale height measurements, on the right-hand side, you are seeing the radial profile of all the different scale height measurements. You can see that this scale height measurement based on the cloud-to-cloud velocity dispersion agrees much better with the ground truth in the simulation compared to your naive estimate based on like a low resolution molecular gas velocity dispersion measurement. So this is telling us that actually our concept works well. It works well of improving the accuracy of our estimation of the scale height. So since this seems like a reasonably good idea, we try to apply this to real observation. And we can already do this because now we have the awesome PHANGS-ALMA survey. So for those of you who are not familiar with this survey, this is an ALMA large program targeting CO 2-to-1 line emission in about 90 nearby galaxies. So the ones I showed here are just about half of the full sample. The key here is the high spatial resolution of the survey. The PHANGS-ALMA reaches on average 1 arcsecond resolution, which translates to about 50 to 150 parsec at the distance of these galaxies. So this means that we are discerning individual molecular clouds in these galaxies. Although I will say that this, the resolution is not high enough so that we can heavily resolve them. So this point was raised in some discussion after Eric's talk 2 days ago. But the key here is that we are discerning individual molecular clouds, and therefore we can measure the cloud-to-cloud motion in the galaxy plane. So we try to do this in the observation. The methodologies are basically summarized on this slide. So first we take the high resolution field velocity field. Then we try to subtract off a low resolution version of the velocity field model that includes both the circular rotation and hopefully other large scale motion like inflow, outflow. And so hopefully what we are left with is the residual velocity map that only contains the differential motion of molecular clouds locally to each other. Then we try to measure this cloud-to-cloud velocity dispersion in radial beam. And then we can, again, convert that velocity dispersion measurement to scale height by combining with our modeling of the stellar mass distribution in the galaxy. So here I'm showing you one example galaxy. This is NGC 628. It is sort of Milky Way-like, but maybe it is slightly lower surface density than the Milky Way. The good thing about this galaxy is that the inclination angle is very low. So there's very little confusion about whether the motion we measure is like along the plane or perpendicular to the plane. So on the left-hand side here, this is the radial profile, again, of the measured velocity dispersions. The lower curves here are the cloud-to-cloud term. And we are measuring that at 4 different resolution level, just to examine that whether this measurement depends on data resolution. And then if we compare these measurements to the dashed line, which shows you the velocity dispersion within molecular clouds, again, you see that the velocity dispersion within molecular clouds is even higher than the cloud-to-cloud term. This means that if you only measure a line width at KT2 scale, you will get the quadrature sum of these two, which will be even higher. And then reflecting in the scale height parameter space, this is the radial profile of our measured scale height from this cloud-to-cloud velocity dispersion. You see that there's a general flaring behavior towards the outer galaxy disk, which is sort of expected. And if you compare that to like the scale height profile in the Milky Way, they're also within the same ballpark. So the values are basically about 20 to 60 parsecs in this galaxy. Here's another example. This galaxy is slightly lower mass. And one thing about this galaxy is that the inclination is slightly higher. And this is also true for a lot of other galaxies in the sample. And in this case, we need to be more careful about interpreting our measured motion between clouds, whether they are in the plane or perpendicular to the plane. But the upshot is that if you look at the scale height, it still has within the same range, the scale height, and it is comparable to the Milky Way. So we have tried to apply this to the whole PHANGS-ALMA galaxies. And there are some broad conclusions we can draw, even though the results are still a little bit preliminary. The first conclusion is that most of the molecular gas scale height is about 30 to 50 parsecs. So this means that if you try to probe, for example, the 2D to 3D turbulence transition, the resolution of your observation needs to be comparably high. It means that the beam fluid hub max needs to be comparable to or smaller than 60 to 100 parsecs. And it's worth mentioning that the PHANGS survey just sits at the edge of this requirement. So it is a bit tricky for PHANGS to actually get the turbulence transition scale. The second implication is that since we see the disk is flaring towards large radius, usually, this means that whatever radial profile you measure for the surface densities, the same profile for volume densities will be steeper because the disk is flaring.
3 minutes.
And this means that if you look at the volumetric star formation law, which relates the volumetric molecular gas density to the volumetric star formation rate, the slope of that law will be closer to slope equals 1. And this is again consistent with the Qing et al. Paper series. There's one important caveat I want to mention here, is that when we apply this method to all the 90 galaxies in the PHANGS sample, we see that there's some trickiness when we are dealing with galaxies that are more inclined and or with strong bars or spiral arm features. And this is because if you have a more inclined orientation, and if there's strong streaming motion in the plane, it will contaminate the measurement of our cloud-to-cloud velocity dispersion, and therefore drive the apparent scale height higher. So this means that realistically, we need to restrict our measurement to a smaller set of galaxies and to a smaller region in them. And this will, and eventually this will allow us to identify dependence on global galaxy properties, such as the total mass, total star formation rate, and maybe inclination. So here's the summary slide of my talk. I think I have maybe 1.5 minutes left. So rather than repeating all this point, I want to instead show you some very cool data I got from a Cycle H project. We might need to shift the topic a little bit here, but I think the data is too cool to not show off. So here, this project, this is looking at the center, the very center of a nearby galaxy, NGC 3351. This galaxy is cool because it has a very prominent circumnuclear star forming ring driven by a bar-driven inflow. Our Cycle H project observed this central region in both band 3 and 7, both at 0.1 arcsecond, which is 5 parsec resolution. So the figure on the right here shows the high resolution, high sensitivity CO322 data that traces the bulk gas with exquisite details. So what you can see that the gas along the ring is clumped into very thin snobs. Further, we also observed this in band 3 continuum, and you can see that there are a lot of continuum sources within those dense snobs. So this is telling you that there are forming young massive clusters embedded in those dense snobs. So this topic was mentioned after Rebecca's talk yesterday. Of course, the resolution here is not as high as the NBC 253 data shown by Rebecca, but this galaxy has a face-on inclination, which means that we will have a much easier time in putting the YMCs into context. And another thing I will just quickly mention is that there's a lot of gas also surrounding the supermassive black hole, but this galaxy don't only have a quiescent black hole. So the kinematics of the CO32 also will hopefully show us how the gas got into the center and maybe why it is not feeding the central black hole. So I will conclude my talk with this composite I made by combining the HSD and ALMA, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm really always fascinated to see all these amazing pictures coming from the PHANGS survey. They're just exquisite. We have time for a couple of questions. So I think we already have quite a few coming.
Yeah, there are plenty of questions in the chat. So I will start with this one. So did you identify individual GMCs to make these measurements? Or is this analysis done per beam? And if so, do you worry that you are maybe mixing more than one cloud within the beam? And would this tend to increase the cloud-to-cloud velocity dispersion that you measure?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So I skipped a little bit about the methodology part. So what we do is that we try two different ways of measuring this cloud-to-cloud velocity dispersion. The first way, so let me shift back to the slide actually. The first way is that we just use the CO moment 1 map, and we take each individual beam as a GMC. So this is motivated by the idea that our beam size is 50 to 150 parsec, which means that each individual beam is about the size or even slightly larger than the individual GMC. So this way, when we measure things, it is possible that there are multiple clouds within the same beam, maybe along the line of sight direction, but are mixed, apparently connected to each other. And therefore, we are putting them all together as one cloud. And this actually shows up when we see data that change in resolution. So when we have data that have lower resolution, meaning larger beam size, we see that the cloud-to-cloud velocity dispersion is smaller. This means that we are attributing more of the line width or velocity dispersion into the intra-cloud term than the inter-cloud term, which also makes sense. And to address this question, we also try a slightly different approach. We try to identify individual clouds within the original 3D cube. And this was done by CPROF. And this actually gives us a slightly better way because the CPROF also tried to blend clouds that are located along the same line of sight but have different systematic velocities. So as long as the two clouds are separated in the velocity field, the CPROF algorithm can also cut them into two. So that provides some constraint on the line of sight blending. But we are finding, I think, comparatively consistent results between the two methods. So yeah, and I think in general, it is hard to read out information that are sub-resolution. So I think this is probably the best we can do with what we have.
I think we have time for one more question.
Maybe I have a very quick one from me. Just can you see a difference between spiral arm regions and inter-arm regions?
Yeah, that is also a very good point. So if I go to this NGC628, so this galaxy have a very strong spiral feature. I mentioned before that the inclination is low, which means that we won't measure a lot of the in-plane motions, but it is still possible that the perpendicular motions vary from the inter-arm region to the arm region. And in fact, some of the wiggles in this plot are likely due to that. Like in some radial beams, we are capturing like a more significant part of the spiral arm, a lot of the clouds there, and therefore the velocity dispersion gets higher. This is something we plan to do further on because we now already have like segmentation map of the whole galaxy. We divide all the galaxy into like different morphological regions, including arm and inter-arm. So we can actually test this by isolating the clouds in different regions. So this is something we would like to do. But thanks for raising this up.
Thank you so much. This was really great discussion. We have quite a few more questions, but you can answer them in the Slack.
Of course.